I want to actually pick up with one thing that you will have heard Nigel Farage talking about there. He said for him, delivering Brexit is more important than keeping the United Kingdom together. Which is more important for you?
Oh, I don't see these as a sort of zero-sum game. Of course we want to keep the union together. And the biggest threat to the union is those calling for a second referendum, because that would be a gift to the SNP, and we shouldn't be doing that.
I mean, it's a gift to the SNP because that would allow them to say they have a right to their referendum. But if the UK voted to stay in the EU, that takes away the SNP's rallying
Rob,
call,
you know what the politics of this would be. So we need to deliver on Brexit, get beyond this rut that the country is in, the government, but also the country at large, businesses, and I think the welling up of public mistrust with our democracy that we saw with the Peterborough by-election, that we saw with the European elections, and then move on. This country needs to move on. We're not going to move on until we get Brexit delivered, which is what the voters expect.
Well, why did your former leader, former Foreign Secretary William Hague, warn only a couple of days ago that a no-deal Brexit, in his view, really heightens the risk of both Northern Ireland and Scotland breaking away? Why did the Prime Minister make that warning to the Cabinet?
Well, I think you'd need to ask them, but from my point of view, as someone who's served as Brexit Secretary, who's been to Northern Ireland, who's toured the border area from Crossmaglen to Newry, I couldn't be more concerned about all the risks. But I think the biggest risk for us right now is that we don't get this delivered, that we allow the tortuous haggle with Brussels to continue and go on and on and on. And not only would I think that be damaging to the economy, I think it would be hugely devastating to trust in our democracy. And of course, those that call for us to stay in the EU are looking to drag us into deep waters so they can make this argument for the second referendum. And I think if you're looking at threats to the union, that's the biggest.
Now, Boris Johnson, after meeting Arlene Foster, the leader of DUP, yesterday, put out a statement that under no circumstances, if he were Prime Minister, would he do anything to reconstitute a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which basically means that he would, since he's opposed to the backstop, which is something so many of your MPs in the DUP oppose, he would do absolutely nothing on our side to impose border checks, if we get out of the EU with a no deal. Does that mean he's basically saying to the EU, if you want a hard border, we're not going to do it, you're going to have to do it?
What he's saying is, and I think there's a huge amount of evidence of this now, is that you can have checks, they just don't need to be at the border. There shouldn't be any extra infrastructure at the border, which of course has all sorts of connotations legally and politically for the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement. So, for example, and I've been to Port of Lairn, you can look at the way that animal checks are done. They can be intelligence-based and driven rather than routine. You can have warehouse...
Hang on. No, you're actually getting off the point I was making. I'm talking about the context. No, you're not, because I'm talking about the context where on the 31st of October we leave without a deal. And then we can't put the technology in place at that moment. We have to make a choice about whether to impose border checks.
Rob,
is he saying there would be no border checks on the 1st of November?
So the point being, and we've got obviously a period of time until October, and you know, to make those preparations, and a huge amount has already been done. There doesn't need to be any checks at the border. It will be hugely damaging for those checks to be done at the border, but that doesn't mean...
So he is saying unilaterally we will not do it, and therefore it's up to the EU whether they do it.
Checks can be done elsewhere. So in terms of what Northern Ireland does with livestock coming in from the rest of the world, that can be done at the Port of Lairn. You can have at depots or warehouses away from the border, checks done on goods. None of this in a modern, technology-driven economy and closely interconnected set of countries and economies needs to be done right at the border.
Nicky, you've been studying all of this. Is Dominic right that, on the 1st of November... we can do all this stuff away from the border?
Not necessarily the 1st of November, but it can. Some of the processes can happen between 6 and 9 months. I suppose.
But I just want to know, when you saw what Boris Johnson said yesterday, there will be no hard border from the UK's point of view, and he will do nothing to do that. How did you interpret that?
Well, I suppose what he's saying is that the UK will not put anything in place if the EU do or if the Irish government decide to.
That's
their decision.
That's what I thought he was saying. But Dominic doesn't seem to be agreeing with that.
No, I do. He's saying he'll put no checks at the border.
So the 1st of November, there will be no checks.
At the border, but that doesn't mean that we can't put checks beyond the border in the ways that we
There
described.
are already checks. So, I mean, there's already there's a VAT border and an excise and everything else. And they're more... You can have checks away from the border, absolutely.
On the 1st of November.
You could, I mean, unless you've prepared for it. I mean, you said actually October is not very far away, and this is the point. The candidates have got to be honest about when they start preparing seriously and how they do for no deal.
But what is interesting to me is there were some people who saw what Boris said, and they said to me it looked to them as though he was backing away from, I've talked to you about this before, the 2017 protocol that we signed with the EU, and I think you're saying Boris still stands by that protocol.
Well, it wasn't a protocol. You're talking about the joint decision.
Yeah, the joint agreement.
Okay, yeah, wasn't a protocol.
All right, the joint agreement that Theresa May, forgive me, but the joint agreement that Theresa May made with the EU, which essentially put in place the framework for the backstop.
Which, of course, would apply if we had a deal, and we don't have a deal. So the point is that, of course, we're not going to put up anything at the border that would imperil either the peace that we have, the stability we would have, or the Good Friday Agreement. But we think that there are ways, albeit, as Nikki says, and her report documents this rather well, over time, that you can actually transition. There's no reason, with goodwill on both sides, why that needs to happen. If the EU, in the spirit of so-called unity, wants to enforce that on the Republic of Ireland, it should say so very clearly. But we're very clear, we're not going to do anything that would put at risk the Good Friday Agreement.
So much more to talk to you about, Dominic. Don't go away, because, as I say, there's plenty more from Dominic, and we'll also be talking to Richard Radcliffe and later John Ashworth, Labour's health spokesman. Welcome back. I'm delighted Dominic Raab is still with me. Dominic, both candidates seem to want to outbid each other with populist measures. We got Boris Johnson tonight, who you're backing, saying he wants 20,000 more policemen. I think it's going to cost over £1 billion. Where's all this money going to come from?
Well, there's 26 billion fiscal headroom, as you know, from the OBR in March, and we're going to have a comprehensive spending review.
But he's already spent considerably more than 26 billion.
I'm not sure he has.
But the IFS say he's spent considerably more than 26 billion.
I'm not sure about that, but we'll have a comprehensive spending.
They do say that.
Well, they may, but unless you set it out and explain to me measure by measure, I'm not just going to take your word for it.
So the IFS is wrong?
No, I'm just not going to take your word for it. I've learned over many interviews with you,
All right, let's go through it.
Yeah, let's go through it.
In which case, you're backing him, and you know, I'm assuming you would quite like to be Chancellor, so I'm assuming you'll have all these numbers as well to hand. But so it's £9 billion for the raising the top rate of to 40%. Raising to 80,000 the threshold for paying 40% tax. I think the IFS, although he hasn't said what he's going to do exactly with national insurance, they assume that's another £5 to £10 billion commitment. He wants to do trains, roads, he wants to do more policemen, he wants more money for education. We're well through the 26 billion.
I think as you demonstrated there, some of that is firm commitment, some of it is aspirational, but we've also got a comprehensive spending review, and I think the big criticism that there's been is not enough policy in this contest. So I think it's good to see Boris setting out his priorities. Cutting taxes for the lowest paid, a big increase on the education budget. I think that's probably
But when the Chancellor says both candidates are risking throwing away your competitive advantage over Labour, which is you are careful with money, he's wrong, is he?
Look, Philip is entitled to caution all of the candidates. I mean, I remember he did very early on in the race. But the reality is that we've got 26 billion headroom, we've got a comprehensive spending review. And of course, you're going to expect the candidates in a leadership contest to set out some directional change and some points of principle that they're going to follow. Boris has been very clear on this. Cutting taxes for the lowest paid and for the middle-income families, a big investment in schools. And you're right, wanting to see more police on the street.
And the other thing Jeremy Hunt has said tonight is that he would legalise fox hunting again. What's Boris's position on this?
Well, look, I think right now, first of all, with a lack of a majority
Don't laugh!
in the House of Commons.
It's just so
I don't
evil.
think Jeremy's suggestion is desperately serious. And I think realistically...
What's your own view on Fox?
Well, as you probably know, that I don't support repeal of the Hunting Act. But I think more importantly, opening up what was a very divisive bit of legislation right now wouldn't seem to me a very practical sense.
Do you know whether Boris does, out of interest? Because I don't know what his position is on this.
My understanding is that there's no suggestion of reopening what was a very divisive debate.
Now, my colleague Paul Brand has disclosed tonight that there are 181 cases of alleged Islamophobia being investigated by the Tory party. He says a large proportion of those individuals accused of Islamophobia are getting a vote in this leadership election, which he's not terribly comfortable with. Are you comfortable about that?
Well, look, people being accused of something or people are being sanctioned for something is very different. We should have due process. The most
An independent probe? Jeremy Hunt said there should be an independent probe.
The most important thing about this is that they're dealt as swiftly but as responsibly as possible. If people have got a charge, and it's quite a significant one, made against them, I think they ought to have an ability to respond to it. And, of course, if anyone is sanctioned, they shouldn't have a vote.
But sorry, on the independent investigation thing, you're not sure, Jeremy, because do you remember? I think you were part of that leadership debate when you all supposedly signed up to it.
I'm very relaxed about having an independent review into this, but that would, of course, be about I think the totality of it rather than individual cases. I don't think you'd have an independent review into each and every individual case.
And so we are pretty much out of time. But now that you're not a candidate anymore, are you still of the view that you're not a feminist?
Look, I think these labels are, frankly, less relevant than what you're willing to do about it. Actually, in the leadership contest, I put out a range of policies which would, for example, we've seen a doubling of the number of new mums returning to work being made redundant. That's something where I think we should provide protection. I think what you do is more important than label.
Well, lovely to see you.
And you.
I hope you get